Okay, I'm done.
All righty. Well, about the quizzes, I know that that was a really short time to try to get all the quizzes in. So because of that, I'm going to actually extend the time for the quizzes. And rather than cover the information on the quizzes this morning, I'm just going to do a whole unit review. And if anybody has questions about the quizzes, just email me, and I'll just try to get back to you as soon as possible. There were a few things that multiple people missed, or almost the whole class missed. And again, in those cases, I'll give you guys some leeway there. So I prepared a little bit of a unit review for us. And it's pretty long, so I'm trying to hit the highlights here, so I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly. But all of the information, or pretty much all of the information, will come from this review. There might be a couple of questions here and there from like out of class readings and stuff, so be sure to check out those things in the resource folder. But we'll get into it, and basically I'm going to go kind of quickly. So if you guys have any questions or need anything elaborated on, just stop me and ask your question, and we'll try to cover it in a little bit more detail. The unit review is under the PowerPoint presentations tab, so and it is in PowerPoint form. So let's go ahead and get into that. Oh, by the way, the format for the first test here is, and basically all of our tests will be on a unit, and then the midterm and final exam will be cumulative. So just keep that in mind. The test will be 50 questions, or 50-ish. There will be some matching on there. A little bit of matching, a little bit of essay, short answer, fill in the blank, true or false, similar to the format of the quizzes. Finally, on the soils lab I asked you all to do, I need to update that to where you can turn in your assignment on that. So just watch for that later today if you've already finished that. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know. All right, let's get into this. All right, everybody good there with the, can you see that?
Yes.
See the PowerPoint? Okay. And I had to kind of paste all these slides into the Chapter 2 presentation, so it's going to say Chapter 2 at the top of everything, but it's the whole unit review. So anyway, first, the history, and I think pretty much everybody's got this down, but just remember that it was 10 to 14,000 years ago that humans began the purposeful cultivation of plants. And I say purposeful with quotation marks just because, you know, we don't know exactly if they did that intentionally or not, but somebody witnessed something. Someone took a seed that from a wheat plant that had not shattered, and that's kind of where we say that agriculture began. All around the world in many different places at once. Next, be sure to know about kind of the main differences there in agronomy and horticulture. Agronomy being the study of field-grown crops and being more extensive, and then horticulture being the more intensive crops. And of course, there are these gray areas where the disciplines overlap, but in general, you know, kind of know the difference between agronomy and horticulture, both being subsets of agriculture. Generally, though, I will refer to agriculture more like in the terms of agronomy, and horticulture just as kind of more of a specialized subset of agriculture. We talked a lot about in the first chapter about some trends and issues affecting plant science, and one of them is just the whole marketing issue and how we're looking kind of at a change in the paradigm, a shift in the paradigm of the marketing, kind of looking more at the ecological values and kind of considering that a little bit more these days, rather than just the cash value of crops. And that really feeds into the whole concept here of sustainability. And something that I like to emphasize about sustainability, you know, it kind of becomes, in some ways, sort of a bad word, and most agriculturists, most kind of traditional farmers, think of it as sort of a greenwashing term. But in my mind, sustainability is more equivalent to survival, long-term survival, right? So we're talking about sustainable crop production, that we're talking about not only practices that are good for the short term, but for the long term, what will allow our future generations to survive and thrive too. Our two major trends affecting crop production and the global environment as a consequence around the planet, generally we talk about human population being overpopulated, right? As well as energy use. And we're seeing, you know, exponential growth, and it's not quite reciprocal at the moment, but energy to population both increasing. And of course, thinking about the future projections of population growth, and how energy use works with that. Of course, there are technologies that are working to kind of reduce or make our energy use more efficient, but still our population growth is not slowing down. So huge issue for us to trying to meet these, the sustainability for the future, basically. We talked about genetically engineered crops and how I really think that we should refer to them as GE, or genetically engineered, rather than genetically modified organisms, because technically, if we look at, you know, all of our crops really have been genetically modified at some point, just through traditional breeding. So genetic engineering, though, is actually conducting, you know, these genetic changes in a lab setting. And often we think about that as transgenic crops, which is taking a gene from one organism and placing it in another. Although really genetic engineering doesn't have to be transgenic either. So just remember, genetically engineered versus genetically modified. It's a better term to talk about. Moving on into kind of the ecology and ecosystems. This is kind of a big deal, and something that I saw on some of the quiz questions. Climate is the main factor that determines the kind of plants that grow naturally in an area, but also what we can grow crop-wise in an agro-ecosystem, as well as the rate at which they grow. And of course, the natural ecosystems are more complex than crop ecosystems. We simplify our agro-ecosystems, and I don't think we could ever really actually make a crop ecosystem that is as complex as a natural ecosystem, especially if we're looking at something like a tropical rainforest. Extremely complex ecology. Talking about ecosystem components, the way that we define the environment determines the boundaries of the population in an ecology or an agroecosystem, natural or controlled ecosystem. And when we grow plants in an artificial ecosystem, an agroecosystem, the whole idea of ecology does not disappear. That includes in greenhouse production or even in indoor plant production too. We still have pests, for instance, and those pests are still kind of operating on an ecological paradigm. Also looking at the whole issue of natural ecosystems, and really some of these, some of our crop production in the future is seeking to kind of emulate natural ecosystems in order to try to achieve sustainability. So by observing these full range of interactions and processes in natural ecosystems, we can try to manage our own crop or agroecosystems better. And again, thinking about the whole idea of a niche, and this is something that we talked about. There's a lot of contention and debate about in in the quiz 2 there about competitive exclusion and how to coexist, organisms must occupy different niches living off of different resources. And a niche, of course, exists, I think, really as the habitat and the resources being partitioned for that organism in that habitat. So looking at, an example of a niche, I think we talked about, warblers, birds feeding in a tree. They could be feeding off of the same insect, for instance, but at different heights in the tree. So it's the same resource, but a slightly different niche in terms of habitat. Or the other way around, we can look at it as they could be feeding the same heights, but off of a different insect. So it's a different resource. So really we have to look at resources and niches both together as how an organism occupies a niche. And applying that into our crop systems, it's kind of the same deal. We need to think about what are the limiting resources for our crop production and how do we partition that so these different portions are accessible to the multiple species we're growing in our crop systems. And I already mentioned that, but the result here being competitive exclusion. And this is just, something to think about that is often practiced. A kind of an ecological technique of a weed control strategy is to plant additional kind of non-competitive crops or non-crop plants to sort of occupy niches that would otherwise be occupied by weeds. We can look at that in terms of cover cropping, planting things like legumes or grasses to hold soil in place and prevent weeds from growing when we're not growing crops. We're also undersowing our crops with a cover crop. Interesting technique to keep weeds down and potentially even to preserve some resources. Talking about the ecological concepts, these symbiotic relationships that we see, definitely know the differences with parasitism, mutualism, where both organisms benefit, and a good example of that being mycorrhiza. That's a fungal organism that lives in the soil, actually providing nutrients to the roots of the plants. That's a mutual relationship because the plant benefits from the nutrients and the mycorrhiza benefits as having a place to live. And then finally, a commensalistic relationship where neither of them is benefit, but neither is harmed either. Or sorry, one benefits and the other is not benefited or harmed. That's commensalism. And, an example of that might be where something lives on something as a habitat, but does not actually benefit that organism that it lives on. So just know the differences there in those symbiotic relationships. And maybe, do some searching on the web. There are actually some really good examples out there of symbiosis in the different types. This is a question a lot of people missed on the quiz, looking at the trophic levels and how generally they depict it as a food chain, but really it's better depicted as a food web because it's a really complex group of relationships, not just something very linear like a food chain. Moving on into climate, into the third chapter. First, talk about temperature, which is one of the big things governing climate, of course, and that being primarily influenced by latitude. And then within latitudes, by altitude, or the height above sea level. Of course, that's not the only thing that governs climate or governs what we can grow, but it's one of the main factors. We also talked about how wind really and the movement of air in the environment can really have significant effects on climate over particular areas, especially where downdrafts are carrying moisture away, and in these cases, creating large deserts. Sorry, keep skipping ahead. Another just simple one there, a wetland as an ecosystem, extremely important, being an ecological buffer zone. And thinking about, for instance, things like hurricanes. Wetlands are these areas where they basically protect inland areas by being this buffer zone. And we can see those both on barrier islands like the Eastern Shore, as well as being inland too, at the mouth of rivers often, estuaries. The big thing that I want to point out on the wetland thing and why we mention it and why it's going to be on the test is because really we're in a unique position where we can potentially enhance or diminish the quality of wetlands due to how we practice agriculture, even, hundreds or potentially even thousands of miles inland, because, all of our runoff drains to wetlands at some point. So whether we use chemicals or the way that we use fertilizers can really enhance or diminish how wetlands act. Next, thinking about just kind of the issue that we're running into today and why overpopulation is such a big deal is that almost all the land that can be easily cultivated, our arable land, is already being used for the production of crops. And that's an approximate thing, because you guys probably see it in your area. We definitely see it here. There's lots of unused farmland or abandoned farmland, especially in the Commonwealth, and that's related kind of to the demographics, the ages rising in farmers. So God bless you all for being the farmers of the future. Plant productivity, and really the productivity of ecosystems is looked at based on biomass production, which we're looking at, carbon dioxide taken in from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is crucial in actually fixing carbon and carbon sequestration. Moving right along, know the most productive terrestrial ecosystems and kind of where we land. And notice again, cropland is, about half as productive as a tropical savanna and less than half as productive as like a tropical forest in terms of really photosynthesis. In terms of carbon fixation, again, cropland is less productive in the biomes that it replaces. And that's particularly true for annual crops because they are not conducting photosynthesis through, the entire season. So perennial agriculture is a little bit different because it extends that part of the time that is photosynthetically active and can fix more carbon and can create more biomass. Again, kind of most of our agriculture is in annual crops, especially our agronomy. When we look at agronomy, all of those field crops are annual crops. And it's kind of wasteful in terms of primary productivity because most of that fixed carbon is removed when we harvest the crops and then has to be fixed again the following year. And I would also highlight here for you guys to check out the Land Institute link. That's under web links, and about what they're doing with perennial crops, especially with perennial grain crops. This wasn't on a quiz, but wanted to highlight the whole idea that plant communities do change over time. Ecology is dynamic, not static. And we look at that in terms of succession. That's vegetative development going from, say, a cleared, plot of land and going back to the climax community, which in our area, in the temperate region, the mid-Atlantic parts of Virginia, we're talking about that climax community as being temperate deciduous forest. And once we get to that climax community, that final step of ecological succession, it becomes really resilient, and it makes it to where species cannot easily invade because all the niches in the ecosystem are filled. So if you go into an old growth forest, which I know there's not much left, you see that this is a climax community. We don't really have invasive plants coming into them. So again, thinking about this in terms of agriculture, how can we, integrate these ecological concepts into our agriculture to make it more sustainable? Can we potentially try to occupy all of the niches of an agro ecosystem? It's certainly possible. It would be difficult and complex to achieve, but that's potentially a way to get more bang for your buck out of agriculture, and potentially become a way to have sustainable food production with a growing world population. And what that might look like would be a polyculture instead of a monoculture. And I would suggest that you guys know the difference between those terms. Monoculture being one crop for a whole field or multiple acreage, thousands of acres. Monoculture is what we see in the Midwest, right? A polyculture is more like a home garden. We have all kinds of different crops in a small area, and therefore we're occupying a lot of different niches. So just a concept and a suggestion that we can possibly try to emulate natural ecosystems in order to make more sustainable food production. Alien species do invade the natural ecosystems, and that can be disastrous. And that's usually our fault. We've moved plants and organisms around the world intentionally and unintentionally, and that has created some irreversible ecosystem effects. For instance, if you clear or disturb the soil, clear land in our area, and you're not actively managing that land, it's going to quickly be filled up often with alien species. We might have some kind of weedy native species too, but we're having major issues with that here on our campus, where we basically graded the entire campus for our stormwater management. And in doing so, now we have all these wild areas that are just full of invasive exotic plant species. And those in turn attract invasive exotic animal species. Right now we're having problems with starlings doing their kind of annual migration. They come in and they eat the fruits of these invasive plants. They deposit their seeds elsewhere, but they can also become a problem for human health too. We can have issues with histoplasmosis, a disease that comes from them. So again, it's something that doesn't just harm our natural ecosystems, it could be potentially harmful for us too. Something that we kind of briefly mentioned, and I think that this could potentially be something to look at in the future, kind of the whole idea of carbon farming or using carbon offset credits. There are actually examples out there where like a cap and trade system has worked. Look up sulfur dioxide and how we basically mitigated sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere through a kind of offset credit program. So I think in the future, we'll probably see, I mean, today even, we're seeing it now, but in the future, I think that there will be more carbon offset credits available to smart farmers. That's something you guys could take advantage of and get more money for your cropping. Talking about plant nutrition and, again, the trophic levels. All plants are autotrophic because they make their own food. And everything else is heterotrophs because we basically live off of plants on some level. Even if you're just a carnivore, you don't eat any vegetables, which I don't know if that's even possible. But let's just say theoretically you're a carnivore, you're still living off of autotrophs because the animals that you eat are eating grass, right, or other plant life. On this slide, just looking again at the types of crops and what they're associated with. And if you guys said that tomatoes were a vegetable on that quiz, I gave you guys credit. I was kind of looking for fruit. And I know that we kind of talked back and forth a little bit on that, how, you know, legally the tomato is a vegetable, but botanically it's a fruit. So I would say for the test, all fruits are any plant that contains seeds, that any crop that contains seeds that is a result from sexual reproduction. Vegetables always come from the vegetative parts of crops. So technically tomatoes and melons here that are listed under vegetable crops, they're not, right? Because they contain seeds, they're fruits. Lettuce, carrots, and asparagus are vegetable crops because they result from the vegetative part of the plant. And also know that today we eat plants from less plant families than we did as hunter-gatherers, which may have some consequences for our diets and health. And also, again, this table is showing the crops related to calories and proteins produced per unit of land area. Highlight the ones that are, you know, temperate and tropical. For instance, sugarcane is a tropical crop. So in terms of calories produced per unit area, it's number one, but you can't grow it in temperate areas. So we're looking at the potato as the highest for temperate caloric production. And in terms of protein, you know, soybeans can be produced in temperate areas, so they're number one. So yes, adults do need 2,000 to 3,000 kilocalories of energy per day, which really just translates to calories. And if you look at nutrition facts on the back of any processed product, then it's based on that 2,000 calorie diet. However, it really depends on a person's size, their metabolism, their level of activity in terms of how many calories they need. Back in 2006, I hiked the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, and in doing so, we found it interesting that we could never get the amount of calories that we burned throughout the day. And as a result, I lost about 30 pounds from Georgia to Maine. Kind of crazy to think about. But again, multiple factors, not just everybody needs this amount of calories. This is a slide I accidentally put in. Skip over that one. We do need about 70 grams of protein, and that's sort of related to body type, but generally pretty much every person needs about 70 grams of protein. We generally get those from grain and legume combinations. Talked a little bit about the amino acids and how to kind of balance amino acids in diet. Of course, amino acids are required to build proteins. And generally, in most diets, we eat proteins, and then we break them down into amino acids with which to build new proteins. In all agriculture worldwide, is looking at some sort of grain and legume mix to get a balanced protein. That's because of the fact that most grains lack methionine and most legumes lack lysine. So by combining those, we get a full range of amino acids with which to build proteins. Some combinations like corn, beans, and squash for Native Americans, or in China, we're looking at, rice and soy are those combinations. And historically, their agriculture is based on that, even though they probably didn't know, that our bodies needed that. I don't know how that worked out. Maybe it was just meant to be. Also looking at the yields of crops, and on our level in the United States, we are, able to achieve, higher yields because of the inputs that we have access to. In other parts of the world, they don't necessarily have access to these inputs, or they might not be environmentally desirable to use on a worldwide scale. So that's just something to look at. And really thinking about that, we have a lot of environmental consequences as a result. Know that worldwide we have about 0.6 of an acre of cropland for each person, which technically that should be enough for people to survive on with slightly growing world population. But we're going to get to a tipping point, right? So think about that and just know that that's how much each person requires. And can we change that? I'm of the belief that we can make that less acreage per person, especially with a very diverse cropping system. This is a very important slide here about crop production becoming concentrated and specialized in regions and countries of the world where the climate is ideal for the production of that crop. For instance, we look at California and Florida as the greatest producer of our fruits and vegetables, and how we move crops thousands of miles from our producers to our consumers, the energy embedded in that. So to try to become more sustainable, again, we have to try to create more localized agriculture and produce those locally, or kind of change our eating habits. So think about that in terms of sustainable crop production, and of course where crops are produced in regards to the climate. They're specialized in the regions where it's best for that crop to be produced and then transported around the country and around the world. And I'm one of those types, again, that does argue from an ecological perspective that we should try to consume local produce. But the big thing pointing out here on nutrient flow, it's kind of crazy to think about. In many cases, like lettuce, for instance, looking at greenhouse production of lettuce, we are shipping water basically, because lettuce is 99% water. We're just shipping water around the country when we're shipping lettuce. So, and we can grow lettuce pretty much everywhere in season. So eating not just local, but eating seasonal produce, I think, is a very important concept that we need to grasp. Big thing with nutrient flow, though, is I want you all to know that we have to balance nutrient flow in order to have sustainable production of crops. For every bit of nitrogen and phosphorus especially removed from the soil and transported away from the farm, we have to bring that nitrogen and phosphorus back to the farm in some other form in order to sustain production. Also know about the issues of water, and for particular crops, it takes a lot of water to produce a small amount of crops. Like they mentioned here, a ton of water, 2,000 pounds of water to produce 1 kilogram of grain, 2.2 pounds of grain. That's kind of crazy. And think about the political and environmental issues associated with that. And also how, we're in a special situation being in an industrialized, developed country. If everyone were to live in this type of economy, agriculture would have to occupy all of the world's land in order to meet the needs of people. And that's also looking at kind of more extensive animal-based agriculture. Only 10% of the energy available in food crops is being recovered in the meat or other animal products. So I'm not saying that everybody needs to become a vegetarian in order for us to survive, but if we ate just less meat, or wasted less meat anyway, then we would actually really greatly reduce the amount of energy and amount of cropland we would need. Because in these industrialized, developed countries, we eat largely meat-based diets. Also, in a livestock situation, we have the issue of disposing of animal waste, which contain the same nutrients as fertilizer. So if you can balance animal and kind of plant crop production, there can be a great way to kind of make more sustainable crop production and reuse those nutrients rather than importing fertilizers. All right, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to move a little bit quicker. Talking about grazing, pasture, and about how much energy that's extracted. It's about 50% of that could be obtained from crops grown for human consumption. And that really, for the best situation for the world's population, if we reserve the best land for the production of crops for human consumption and then confine animals to marginal land or where we cannot produce crops, then we would be in a much better situation. Again, grazing has to be managed so it does not lead to the degradation of soils. However, pasture does support higher levels of biodiversity than the fields from which crops are harvested. So I'm not saying anything bad about animal or plant production for crop production. I think that there just needs to be a good balance of both and looking at the land which is more acceptable for each one. We talked about how historically we got a lot of our fibers and fuels from plant materials. However, today in developed nations, most of these non-food materials have been replaced by synthetic materials. Biofuels are an example of how we're kind of reversing that trend and right now it's really not sustainable because of the whole fact that energy is required to produce those fuels. So the net gain in fuel energy may be as low as 50%. However, if it is accompanied with some other type of agriculture and you're making the full use of the crops, then it does make sense. So biofuels definitely could be a component of agricultural future for sure, especially if we look at the use of biotechnology to increase the ways that we could not just produce biofuels, but other chemicals, especially medicines from crops. 1930, plants supplied about 30% of raw materials. Today, it's over 80% of those coming from synthetic materials, mostly from chemicals from petroleum products. And many think that this trend is going to reverse, mostly because it has to. Again, ethnobotany, looking at how indigenous cultures use plants, and really we think about that a lot in terms of medicine. And until recently, most of those medicines were derived directly from plants. Today, of course, they're not. However, I think we're going to see that trend change as well. Talked a little bit about biophilia, and one of the ways that we really kind of use biophilia and could make money off of biophilia is kind of looking at horticulture, the desire for cut flowers or potted plants in the home or in landscapes. kind of more of a horticultural application there. Lawns, of course, are technically the largest irrigated crop in the U.S. Kind of crazy to think about. Again, I think this is a trend that's going to change too, because it has to, especially in drought areas like California, for instance. It's already started to change there. On the horticultural end, we have serious issues with our biophilia, because the ornamental side actually may require even more intensive use of fertilizers and pesticides. So that's a huge issue the horticulture industry is grappling with right now. One way to kind of get out of that is by using native plants in landscaping, for instance. All right, moving on to the next chapter, talking about climate, the prevailing weather conditions of an area, and I think of it more compared to weather. You know, weather is actually the actual values of climatic variables, but really we're looking at weather in a particular amount of time, a smaller amount of time, and a particular area too, a smaller area rather than climate. Know the difference between macroclimate and microclimate, and that how both climate determines the kind of natural vegetation that grows, but vegetation can also affect climate, especially in terms of microclimate. Day length varying throughout the year because of the tilt of the Earth on its axis. However, at equinox, which we just experienced, we're not tilted relative to the sun. We were, basically 12 hours everywhere on Earth. So, hey, welcome. Happy fall, everybody. The autumn equinox has occurred. Of course, at the solstice, either winter or summer, it's when we're tilted either away or towards the sun, so that we, have a different photo period, basically, depending on where you're at latitudinally. Higher latitudes, it's more difficult to grow crops. Really, you can't do it in the winter without supplemental lighting, because we don't have enough light. Also, really, at our latitude, it's difficult to grow crops in the winter. They don't really put much growth on. They kind of just, at a certain point, just kind of are there in, stasis pretty much. However, in the summer, because they have more sunlight in northern latitudes, they can actually grow cool season vegetables very productively, even better than we can. Big thing here, talking about photoperiodism, the response to plants in day length, and that there are long day plants and short day plants. And in certain crops, you have to look at those day lengths and how they might affect it. Photomorphogenesis is basically how the plant shape is affected by light quality. And we can see it's a huge issue in greenhouse crop production, because even with glass that has excellent light transmission, you are reducing light, changing the light quality. Big thing here on water and the hydrologic cycle. Just want you to know that we really don't have much water really available to us. We're looking at less than, really it's like 1% or less that is actually available to humans. Kind of crazy to think about. Evapotranspiration, that's the addition of both transpiration and moving water through plants from soil to the atmosphere, and evaporation, it's combining both evaporation and transpiration. And that's one measure that we look at when looking at the water cycle. Looking at defining the climate of the region, water is, so probably temperature is one of the biggest, but water, they're kind of tied there for number one. The amount of precipitation and evaporation for the natural climate, the natural crop production is crucial. However, using irrigation, of course, we can actually make areas that naturally would be unsuitable for crop production and make them not only suitable, but actually in many cases better because of this, because pests and diseases can be greatly reduced by using irrigation. However, irrigation does have consequences. It can introduce salts to the soil. Salinization is a big issue in dry areas where we're practicing large or very large amounts of irrigation. However, temperature, again, I think temperature and water are pretty close together in terms of natural plant growth. However, in terms of crop growth, temperature is really what governs where a plant can be grown. And again, that's affected by the altitude. As the elevation increases, the air pressure decreases and air temperature drops. Also, water vapor is important. So cloud cover can actually limit radiative heat loss. And we see that especially in desert areas with massive temperature swings, less cloud cover, more heat loss at night. Can be important for growing which crops. Wanted you guys to know about your USDA plant hardiness zones and how they're defined according to the minimum temperatures that can be expected. So look at the maps, know what your USDA plant hardiness zone is, and how that really affects the perennial crops we can grow mostly. It's going to affect, by the first and last frost dates, what annual crops we can grow, but mostly the perennials we're looking at here for hardiness zone. Also know about the Coriolis effect and how the rotation of the planet is what causes this shift of winds and really the creation of desert areas. Know the components of dry air, and that in dry area, nitrogen is the largest component. 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Who would have thought? And of course, soil bacteria can actually, especially things like mycorrhiza, rhizobium, can actually take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it in plants, which is the same process basically that we do on an industrial scale with the Haber-Bosch process to actually create ammonia fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. Talking about carbon sequestration and the future of carbon farming, you have to actually be able to hold CO2 for many years. So we're looking at that mostly in perennial agriculture. Moving right along to soils. Know the 5 factors of soil formation. Know what soil is and what it consists of. And how the type of soil affects the ability to support plant growth. The porous spaces and structure of the soil are extremely important as well, and what a productive soil looks like in terms of having about half pore spaces for water and air drainage. Parent material, of course, being the rock, right, that soil comes from. And as it's broken down, it creates characteristic layers known as horizons. And then the horizons become more distinguishable and developed into soil profiles. Know what happens with high rainfall, and something a lot of you put on the quiz, erosion. I counted that too, but also recognize that soils are often highly leached, reducing fertility, and also become kind of acidic with higher rainfall. Also know that in soil, we have life from all 5 kingdoms. Know what organic matter is and how important it is. Without well-developed horizons, we have young soils. The younger the soil is, the less well-developed horizons are. Know what each horizon is and the different components of it. A horizon, B horizon, C horizon. Very simplified in the text, gets more complex. Also know about the soil texture. What is sand, silt, and clay? What are the sizes of those particles in soil? And how they influence crop production. And how they influence the ease of tillage here. And that the ideal agricultural soil is a fairly even mix of sand, silt, and loam, known as a sandy, silty loam. Finally, I'm looking at pH, the negative logarithm of hydrogen activity in the soil solution. Know what pH is, and also look at that pH scale there, that it goes from 0 to 12, with 7 being neutral or a sweet soil, and that the availability of nutrients is influenced by soil pH. Just a couple more things real quick. Cation exchange capacity, the ability to attract and hold cations in a particular type of soil, and know what types, clay and organic humus fractions of the soil are responsible for cation exchange capacity. And then finally, again, organic matter and what it does. And when it becomes stable, it's known as humus. All right. That's the review. I know that was a lot in a very short amount of time. So again, if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, just let me know. We're over our class time, so I'm going to have to say goodbye now. But hope you all have a great day and good luck on the test. I'll try to get that up today and have it open until next Wednesday. I'm going to open up the quizzes and leave them open till next Monday. Any questions, comments, or concerns? All right. You all have a great day.
Okay. Bye, everybody.